The really fun thing about the internet and the blessing of it, I know there's a lot of downsides to it, but the blessing is that there are real people, real moms, real homeschool moms on the other side of it, sharing their experiences, sharing what they have learned so that you can be encouraged and grow in your role as a homeschool mom. Jamie Erickson has been doing that through her podcast, Unlikely Homeschool. And she has been a blessing to me for pretty much all of the years of my homeschooling. She was one of the originals that I found online when we began to homeschool. And she's been a source of great encouragement. And it's been fun to watch her grow in her homeschool mom role as well as watching her children grow up as too. And today I was able to sit down and have a really amazing conversation. I just soaked it all in, and you're just going to love it. You're going to love what she is going to share about books and reading. And I know that you are going to hear yourself in the different scenarios and in the different topics that she discusses. So buckle up. I promise that this is going to be a really good episode for you.
Welcome to Little by Little Homeschool Podcast, where you'll learn tips and strategies that will empower you to home educate your children. I'm Lee Nguyen, a homeschool mom of over 12 years, which includes 2 graduates. When I started homeschooling, I was pretty much on my own and was desperate for encouragement and help. My mission is to be a source of encouragement and help to you. Whether you are just beginning your homeschool journey or you're deep into the homeschool lifestyle, Little by Little Homeschool wants to help you stay the course, because all the time you are investing into your children is completely worth it. If you're ready to take your homeschool to new levels, keep listening. Welcome to today's podcast episode, and I am super thrilled about our guest today. So welcome to the podcast, Jamie.
I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
You are welcome. I feel like this is like an honor for me because before I even ask you my first question going into this, I think you were literally probably the first homeschool blog that I found. And I was trying to rack my brain this morning, trying to think of where was it? Maybe it was through Pinterest. I'm not really quite sure because I probably almost had even like dial-up internet at that point or something. I don't know. So
back
thank
in the
you.
dinosaur days of blogging. Yep.
Yep. I love it though. It's so good. But can you start off with just sharing a little bit about who you are, a little bit about your family, your homeschool, just give the listener a little bit of a glimpse into your life?
For sure. I was a trained teacher in the classroom prior to having children, and I always thought that's exactly where I would end up. I loved teaching, still do, but it was right around the time I got married that my mother-in-law asked me if I would ever consider homeschooling. She had homeschooled both of her sons back in the 80s and 90s when it was really weird and practically illegal. I mean, she had the truant officer called on her once. And I laughed at her, not intentionally. A giggle just came out. And I thought, absolutely not. I mean, I'm a trained teacher. My experience in the classroom would practically align with that of a working mom. My kids could come to school with me and we'd have the same days off and the same vacation time. And it just seemed like on paper that was the best route. And it wasn't until I had my first baby and I stared down at this little pink bundle and I thought about all the time that I spent in the classroom with these kids and how I kind of got the very best of their days and experienced all these wonderful firsts with them. And then I sent them home and basically their parents at the end of the day got all the leftovers. As I was looking at this little baby, I thought to myself, I don't want to just get the leftovers from her days. I mean, she wasn't even a day old yet and I'm already, forecasting doom on her educational career. But I just knew that I wanted something different for her. And so it was then that God began to tug on my heart to maybe consider homeschooling her. And we've been doing it ever since. That little pink bundle graduated a few years ago. She's 20, going to college. And then I just graduated another one this past spring. I still have 2 high schoolers at home and 1 middle schooler. And I think we'll be starting, if I do the math, year 17 coming up here in the fall.
We kind of lose track of the time. I will
Yes.
kind of fumble with the time too. I'm like, it's just a little bit of a blur. And I love that your mother-in-law said that to you, and it just probably planted that little bit of a seed
Yeah.
in you. And then once you saw her, you're like, okay, maybe this is the right course for our family.
Yeah, I'm one
So
of the lucky ones. I know that I am kind of the anomaly, but I do have a mother-in-law and a mom who fully support me and always have in this realm of homeschooling. And even if they didn't right from the get-go, I think that the fruit is there, and that slowly over time, had they been a bit of a dissenter at the beginning, I think that the fruit would have pulled them over to my side of the aisle.
I agree with you. Not everybody sees what we're trying to do. And then as the kids get older and you have two graduated now, and they can see, yes, that there is fruit and it's worth it. And
Right.
Yeah, that's great to have them in your corner for that. But today we're going to talk about helping moms raise discerning readers who love good books. I know that you are a huge reader, and I'm excited to just kind of, I'm not going to say grill you here, but just ask a bunch of questions. And so the moms can feel encouraged and empowered. So let's just start off with, what are your best tips for moms of little ones to develop a love for literature in kids who can't quite read yet?
Yeah, and I know on your podcast you've had other speakers and writers and homeschoolers who have come and shared about reading aloud. And so I want to start right there out of the gate. The Commission on Reading said that the single most important activity for building the knowledge required for eventual success in reading is actually reading aloud to children. So that should be a no-brainer. But then I'd also encourage moms, I think sometimes in our desire to have this Pinterest-worthy house or Instagram-worthy house, we might have books on a shelf, and we have these really Instagrammable pretty shelves that are color coordinated and look beautiful. But what that does is it makes those books inaccessible to little ones, because we don't want them pulling them off the shelves. We don't want them chewing them up or tearing them up. You have to create a language-rich environment with lots of quality books, and I think that's the key. It's not about quantity, it really is about quality, and have them accessible to your little ones. I would also add, even if your kids are not old enough to read, dedicate some specific times in the day when both you and your kids can read for pleasure, even if their reading just looks like turning pages and looking at picture books, because you're training their affections towards good books and developing a habit of making it a priority. And you cannot skip out on reading for pleasure yourself. They actually have to see you doing that, because if you say that reading is important and you want it to be important in the lives of your kids, then you can't just give lip service to it. You actually have to make it a line item in the schedule. So in our homeschool, almost since the very beginning, we have read for pleasure for 15 minutes every single day, kind of after our morning time when we're all gathered in the living room anyway. I set a timer and everything because I want to make sure we get every single minute squeezed out of that timer. And we all plop down in comfy places around the living room with the book that we happen to be reading for pleasure by ourselves, and we read. And so when I had little ones, I actually had a special basket that I filled with library board books. I tried to rotate them out for interest's sake, and I would sit right next to that little one, and they would pull books out of the basket, turn the pages, and even a little one who cannot read can be trained in the habit of having a focused time. Maybe it's not fully 15 minutes at first, maybe it's only 5 minutes, but setting aside time to develop a habit of turning pages and looking through books and making it a priority in the schedule. I think, going back to quality for a second, don't settle for twaddle. There's nothing necessarily wrong with twaddle, and when I use that word, I mean books that have light, fluffy stories. Oftentimes they center on cartoon characters, popular characters. There's nothing wrong with twaddle, but I kind of think that they're like the potato chips of reading. Like, you and I can have potato chips every now and again, but we don't want to make it a steady diet of them. And I think it's the same for reading. What you're really wanting to do is create a home library and nurture books in your home that are captivating, that have really well-developed storylines and characters. Because listen, your kids, no matter how young they are going to have so many things vying for their attention. And reading, by its very nature, is less flashy. Let's be honest. It's slow, it's contemplative. So if we're going to draw them away from something, away from those flashy screens or other things that are trying to grab their attention, we better be ready to hand them something even better. We better have something really captivating at the ready, because otherwise we're just fighting an uphill battle.
The point that you make about modeling is so true, because we often don't think about it when reading. We'll think about it when it comes to maybe eating healthy or moving and exercising our body or getting enough sleep in a lot of different areas. And I think as moms, we just don't think that it is important to model the reading, because we know that they will say and repeat the things. If you ever had a little one, they repeat something and you're like, ooh, I probably shouldn't be saying that either if they're repeating that and they're copying an action. And so I think that's really important for us to be able to model it. And not every parent grew up in a home that did a lot of reading. I wanted to read more. I just didn't have access to books. And after college, I didn't read. I put aside books. I was so done with it. And so it took me some time. And now my kids will find me like, where's mom? Oh, she's sitting out back reading again. Or I've got a whole stack of books, and it's something that they've been able to pick up. So it's something that moms can start. It doesn't mean that you are too late if you're not a big reader.
Absolutely. And I would say, especially for homeschool moms, we plant the flag of reading is the most important. We understand that once your child has learned to read, they can then read to learn. And there's this great divide that happens right around third grade for most kids when they transition and cross that bridge to the next stage. And so we plant our flag and we say reading is really important. But what we inadvertently do with how we plan our schedule is we put it on the very bottom, because we are sure to carve out time in the day for math practice and for, even other language art skills, but just the sheer pleasure of reading. We Americans are busy addicts, so we say, don't just sit there, do something. But we have to put feet to our words. If we're saying that reading is important, then we need to make sure that we prioritize not just reading for learning's sake, reading for pleasure's sake in our homeschool day.
And having those times, like you mentioned, I love that it was just, you had it in your routine, like in the rhythm of your day. That's what's going to happen. Your kids knew that was going to happen. I think kids, when they know what's expected, they can easily fall into that. Now, what about for kids that when they are starting to transition from reading picture books to chapter books? Do you have any tips for that?
Well, I always recommend that a mom first starts reading aloud. If she's reading aloud anyway, picture books during the day, begin to transition to anthology type picture books like The Complete Adventures of Peter Rabbit or Curious George, something where it's an all-in-one anthology of individual picture book stories, because you're introducing the idea of chapters, even though it's not a chapter. Each individual story is like a one and done. It sort of wraps up on itself. But your kids will begin to see that the characters are carrying over from day to day, but it doesn't necessarily require a child to remember plot points from the previous quote unquote chapter. And then after you've done that for a while, introduce some easy illustrated chapter books like Henry and Mudge, Frog and Toad. Those storylines, they're not always the most riveting in those early reader style chapter books, but they're simple enough to allow a young listener to develop this idea of continuation, this realization that the story doesn't end. We're going to pick up on it tomorrow. And the plot has several pieces, and that one little story is connected to the next. Now, one key to those illustrated chapter books, they're usually really short, and you and I can probably read it from cover to cover in one sitting. But if you're trying to develop that habit of introducing them to chapter books, I would say, even if you can read it in one sitting, even if your child is really captivated on their edge of their seat and wants you to read one more chapter, mommy, don't finish the book in one sitting, if at all possible. You're trying to establish the habit or the idea of longevity. And then once you have done that for a while, then you can begin to step into lengthier storylines. But here's the key that I always encourage moms. Watch the movie first. So find a book that has a movie. Now, generally speaking, I would never tell somebody to watch a movie first. But if you can find a movie that actually follows the plot line of the book, my favorite is the old original Charlotte's Web, because honestly, a lot of the dialogue in the movie is word for word from the text. of the book. So if you watch the movie ahead of time, you're introducing the characters, the basic plot points of the narrative, and you're kind of providing a cheat sheet for your little one. So after learning about the storyline, he won't have to do so much mental work when it comes to listening to the story. Then when you sit down to read the story, he's just listening and captivated because these are characters he knows. He's interested. He sort of knows what's going to happen next, and he will be on the edge of his seat. So definitely look for the movie first, but try to find one that aligns with the actual text of the story and follows that. It doesn't have to be a word perfect match, but if you find one that doesn't align, you're just going to confuse the child. But those are just a couple of steps to slowly transition and easily pivot from picture books to long form novels.
These are brilliant ideas because I remember with my kids, they were so used to having the pictures and then moving to chapter books when I was reading to them, they kept looking over my shoulder and looking for pictures, and they had to learn to picture it in their minds. And to be honest, I've never heard anybody say to watch the movie first, but I like that you've added just for this time.
Right. Yes. Yep. Just for one or two times. And you have to understand your kids do that. They peek over your shoulder because it uses a different part of their brain when they have to imagine the picture in their mind and draw it on their brain. And that's a good thing, but it takes skill and it takes practice. And the good thing about some of those early chapter books is there are pictures included. So you can kind of help them along the way, but do your best to try to get them to create that world in their head, and it helps when you watch the movie first.
You just saying it's a skill that makes so much more sense for anybody that has done this transition for kids and they can't quite picture it in their mind. And I think it also might be more difficult for kids. I don't know. I'm just saying this out loud. I've not done any research. Maybe for kids who are on screens a lot, who maybe watch a lot of movies and cartoons and YouTube videos, and it might be harder for them to transition, but there's hope that they can, right?
Yeah. Yes. Okay. Yep. And I would say if you have a child, this really does come back to comprehension. But if you have a child who is really struggling, and you can kind of see that, especially if you have a bit of a screen addict and you're trying to slowly transition them to books, even when you're doing this stage of picture book anthologies or illustrated chapter books, don't show them the picture right away. Show them every other page and help them to imagine the scene in their head.
When it comes to books, sometimes it can get expensive. It can get to be a lot to accumulate those. I remember getting a lot at garage sales, and then we would just it'd be like a box. I remember going to a garage sale and this mom had boxes and boxes, and it was an entire box for like $1. And I was like, these are gold. How can it only be? And then eventually I was that mom 15 years later, like, okay, who wants all these picture books? But I just remember kind of going through and just finding the really good ones and keeping the ones that my kids loved. But the library is also a really great resource. But more and more, it's kind of becoming a little bit tricky for Christian families. And I know that you have talked about, we'll say like this plumb line of using Philippians 4:8. How can moms help their child to select books based on Philippians 4:8? And I'm going to read that verse real quick here. I actually did an episode a little while back all about this verse because it is the verse that I use to discern for most any decisions, not just books, but movies, maybe social media, maybe even people that you follow on social media, YouTube, how we spend our time and all that. So I'm going to read that. And then if you can kind of share how we can use this to help teach our children to pick books. So Philippians 4:8 says, finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. Now that's the ESV version. So some of the words can be different in different versions, but it's basically the same thing.
Yeah, and I would say if you're listening, and Philippians 4:8 admittedly is kind of my plumb line. It sounds like it's your plumb line too, but if you're listening and that's not your plumb line, I would imagine because you're homeschooling, you have some kind of plumb line. And there is something about the other way, we'll say, that you would like to do differently. And that probably spills over even into your book choices. So I'm going to use Philippians 4:8 as my guide. You can think about whatever it is that is your guide. And as you go to the public library, yes, it is a wonderful resource. I get giddy every time I walk away and I see the little dollar sign at the bottom of my library receipt that says how much money you've saved by checking out books. And I probably could be a millionaire today if I, banked all of those dollars, because the public library has been such a foundational piece to my homeschooling. But as you mentioned, it is becoming trickier and trickier, especially for Christian families. I'm not a big advocate for just allowing children to sort of mindlessly wander through the library, picking and choosing random books, because they might contain inappropriate language or themes, especially in the early years when kids are like the elementary to tween years, when kids are beginning to develop a world view. That's the time that they need to be trained and pointed in the right direction. That's the time that we need to be developing habitual affections to what is good and beautiful and right. So I typically take 3 different approaches when helping my kids select or consume books at the library, and it really depends on their ages. For the right out of the gate, I want to recommend that every family, regardless of how small your house is, I mean, I used to live in a 900 square foot house, so I know about teeny tiny living spaces, but regardless of the size of your house, I strongly recommend that every family, every homeschooling family, curate a large family library that books that you have vetted, because then your kids can go to the shelves and they can see that every single book on that shelf is a yes. It's a feast for the taking. You're ensuring that they always have something appropriate to read. And as a side note, you're also preserving historical accuracy, because that's something else that's being culled out of public libraries lately. But that's the first step in training their affections, is to get them invested in good quality literature. It kind of goes back to the idea of like when somebody's being trained in recognizing counterfeit money, they first have to see real money, the real thing, and they immerse themselves and memorize what real money looks like. Then they can easily spot a counterfeit. So that's the first step. You want to immerse them in real, good quality literature so that their bent naturally goes that way. Second, when my kids are younger and they're starting to read chapter books, I don't just give them a free-for-all in the library. What I do is I gather 5 or 6 appropriate titles for them from the library. Maybe these are titles that they have mentioned wanting to read, and I've, vetted them to the best of my ability. Maybe these are books that I think they would be interested based on their current interests, based on other authors they've liked previously. Or maybe it's just a topic or theme I'd like to introduce them to, because I feel like that could be a breadcrumb to lead them to something else. But I gather about 5 or 6 books, and then I lay them out before my kids, and maybe we read the back copy, and I let them choose. You see, I'm still giving them a choice, and I'm helping them decide and discern what kind of reader they are. I'm just not giving them a free-for-all. They're having the power of choice, but with some handholds, some safeguards, so that I can ensure I can protect them from the wolves that are prowling at the door. And then third, I would say this step comes when they begin to be late tweens, early teens. I start to take a more hands-off approach to their book selection. And that's not to say that I have an anything goes attitude, but I encourage them to use that biblical discernment that I've been nurturing in them for the past, 10, 12 years. And I begin to step away, because eventually you have to start handing over the reins. Choosing what to read is a skill that needs to be practiced. So I do allow them to choose, and we have some really great conversations about books. I know my middle son is definitely, by and large, hands down, my biggest, most avid reader. And because he's such an avid reader, it is difficult to continue to put good books on his palate. And so I started a book club just for him and his teen friends who also were interested in reading, because that forced me to make reading his books a priority so that I could have conversations with him and he could read some of these trickier books, but I can use them as a lens for developing a good, solid biblical worldview. So those are just the 3 steps that I take. And again, you have to know the ages and stages of your kids and what they are capable of handling. But eventually your goal is to work yourself out of a job. In the early years, your job is to protect and guard and be sort of the watchdog for your kids. But eventually you do have to hand over the reins.
And trust that what you have done, that they will have that discernment and that the Holy Spirit will prick them if
Right.
they're reading something that they shouldn't, and they will admit to it and say this isn't a good book, and just teaching them that discernment. I had a very voracious reader as well, my daughter, and in the beginning I felt like I had to read every book before her, but eventually I was like, I can't. I can't spend this many hours reading books. And so we worked through this, and she has such great discernment. And the neat thing is that she knows and has read so many books that she's been a really good. Well, I'll go to her and I'll say, what are some recommendations you have for your younger brothers? And she knows them so well. And she would just pick these great books for them to read, because they weren't the ones that would run into the library, and they would like try to head to like the movie section or something like that sometimes.
Right.
And so she would be like, how about this book? So let's talk about, though, advanced readers. What does a mom do when her child is really advanced? And you have any tips for how they can keep up with their child's reading appetite?
Okay, I want to camp on that word advanced reader for a second. And I chat with thousands of moms every month about reading. And I would say we can have this obsession over reading level, because we want them to be reading the books that are challenging to them or that are at their cognitive skill level. But when we do that, when we obsess over quote unquote reading level, we forget two really key components to the reading life. First, accelerated readers may be able to read advanced books. Like my daughter was in 3rd grade and she was reading at a 12th grade reading level. So she could read the literature of a 12th grader, but she was not emotionally or socially or spiritually ready to handle that mature content that was found in those books. So in our preoccupation of reading level, we kind of inadvertently trade wholesome innocence for impressive vocabulary. That's the trade-off. And you have to ask yourself, which is more important to you? Secondly, I think when we obsess over reading level, we often don't allow a child to read below their reading level. But reading below a reading level actually improves a child's fluency, which in turn naturally creates ease. So kids who find reading easy are going to naturally be more inclined to want to read. Nobody wants to do anything that's a slog, right? You and I both naturally do things and enjoy doing things that are easy to do and that we enjoy doing. I really encourage a mom that at any time, regardless if you have an advanced reader or a struggling reader, any reader should be exposed to 3 different types of texts. And this will help him or her to continually grow in reading ability. So first, every reader should be introduced to a story that's slightly above his reading level. These are books that you might read to him or that he might hear in audio format. These are books that introduce advanced vocabulary that he's not familiar with, maybe complicated, more enriching sentence patterns, thought-provoking content. And then secondly, he should be reading stories at his reading level. These are books that he can read on his own. Maybe they might contain a couple of tricky words, new to him concepts. These will help continue to advance his decoding skills, especially if he's just learning to read. It'll keep his skills fresh, help him to develop new ones. These are books that will meet him right where he is, but also maybe encourage him to go further. So that's the second type of text that every child should be introduced to. And then the third is to be reading books that are slightly below the reading level. And I think that really is the part that moms with advanced readers forget, because these are books that he's probably already enjoyed in the past and he continues to go back to. And so many moms struggle with allowing their kids to reread things because, like, you and I don't like to reread things probably. I rarely reread a book. There's so many wonderful books out there to use my time on that I don't want to reread a book. But when you have a child who is an advanced reader, rereading can actually be where the delight comes from. A delight in a reading experience. It'll encourage him to keep reading. So never underestimate the power of a reread. The book might be the exact same book, but your child won't be the exact same child. He'll have grown. He'll have formed new ideas. He'll have looked at the world a little bit differently, and he'll bring all those personal pivots into that one reading experience. And so the book really will be fresh and new. And I think also in rereading that continued overexposure to something, he'll slowly move certain words that are just sort of in his recessive vocabulary into his active vocabulary. Now he's actually using them. And that only happens through overexposure. When you repeatedly hear or see a word. For the mom who, you and I both confess to having a child that we just cannot keep up with their voracious reading appetite. For the mom who has one of those kiddos, and, let's face it, you probably cannot pre-read everything that they read. I'd really encourage you to latch on to a couple of proactive vetting sources that you can trust. And there's lots of vetting sites out there. The reason I emphasize proactive, there's a lot of reactive sites where you can type in a book and get some feedback on that book, and that's helpful, but that's just one book. A proactive site will actually give you lists of books based on your child's reading and sort of reading desires and palette, and provide lots of books that are free of sexual content, language, political agenda, all those things. So if you can latch a hold to some proactive vetting sites that have basically done the work for you so that you don't have to invent every single wheel.
Jamie, this is all so brilliant. I wish I had you. Well, I mean, you had your blog then, but maybe you didn't have this part of it, or I hadn't read it.
Yeah.
This would have so helped me because I was that stressed out mom and had to say that it was okay for her to read books that were maybe quote unquote below her level because, again, not quite ready for the maturity level of those higher books. So as we talk all about books and reading, I know that you are not a fan of book reports, and most of us grew up in school, and that is what we had to do. You read a book, you wrote a book report. I remember them kind of being the bane of my existence. I was like, I read the book, I can tell you about it. So what for you are some alternatives that the homeschool mom can use to help with the reading comprehension?
Well, I want to flip it for just a second and ask you a question. Okay. When you were assigned those book reports, like, give me a snippet of what that did to your desire to read. When you knew at the end of this great book, this wonderful literary experience that you just had, you had to then write a big, long, lengthy report. What did that do to you in the next time you picked up a book?
I mean, just even reading that book, I didn't necessarily enjoy it. I mean, I do remember reading and enjoying some books, but most books I just didn't enjoy. And so it seemed as a chore. It was just like something that I had to do. It wasn't for fun. And like I told you, even after college, I was like, I don't want to read it. And I feel like the fact that I had to do book reports and things were mandated for me, maybe it's my personality, just made me not want to read on my own.
Yeah, I think anytime we make book reports, the end pot of gold at the end of the rainbow, like after this wonderful experience, that's what's at the very end of it. We sabotage a love of reading in our home because when we make an assignment, it suddenly becomes work. Here's the thing about book reports. I do think they have definite benefits for teaching the skills of writing expository reports, but that comes later. Middle school and high school is when your kids really dive deeply into expository writing. The whole point of a book report is based around the idea that a teacher in a classroom has, let's say, 30, 40 students, and they have to find a sort of just add water and stir method of proving the reading frequency and the understanding or comprehension of all 30 or 40 students. Like, they have to have a tangible, three-dimensional proof that this child read it and he understands it. And so a book report is needed and necessary over there in the brick and mortar school. But you as a homeschool mother, you are physically with your very own eyeballs seeing him read, watching him turn pages, and hopefully you're having some good conversations with him about the book as proof that he understands it. So really, if you're wondering if your child is understanding and retaining what he's learning, all you really have to do is have a good discussion about it. And that's relational building. So set the book reports aside, ditch those. You just need to have some good conversations. Just one well-chosen question or statement can get the words flowing in ways that a black and white question on a book report isn't going to do. So think of some open-ended questions. I have many of them on my blog and in my book, Homeschool Bravely, but just to get your wheels turning, you can ask things like, what was your favorite part of the book? What was your least favorite part? That's an easy low-lying fruit to grab. If you could play any part in the book, be any one of the characters, which one would you choose to be? Do you think this book would make a really good movie? Why or why not? If you had a chance to ask the author any question about the story, what would you ask? So you're just looking for open-ended questions, ones that don't just end in a yes or no. If you ask a kid, especially a middle schooler, will say, how did you like the book? What is the answer you're going to receive?
It was good.
It was good. It was fine. That's going to be a very short conversation. But if you encourage your child to talk about the book by asking open-ended questions, and not just talk to you about it, encourage your child to talk about it with a sibling or a friend, because those conversations are really developing the critical analysis skills that you're looking for in a really natural way. And as he begins to be comfortable discussing books, that will continue throughout his lifetime. And he will develop a culture of reading. Others will gather around, because as he's talking about books, he'll naturally gravitate towards other kids who likes to talk about books. And so siblings and friends will begin to word of mouth advertising about stories that they've liked. And that will only serve to help you as he's getting recommendations from other people that you know and trust about books.
Those are some great questions. And I think that a lot of us as homeschool moms, especially who went to public or private school, we're stuck in that mindset that we have to have something written to prove that the child has done this reading. But I've seen them sitting on the couch doing the reading, and I've had conversations with them, and that actually is enough. And so hopefully the homeschool mom listening realizes that that is enough. It's more than enough as you're giving us a glimpse as to where this can go with the child that's reading and has this opportunity to have open-ended questions asked and have a conversation about it.
Right, because in the end, the whole point of critical analysis of a book isn't just to prove that you know the facts of the book. It's the same with learning history. It's not enough just to learn the dates, places, and names. What we're trying to nurture and cultivate in their reading life, as well as I'll say history, is critical analysis. And that means not just the what, but the why and the how. So you're actually helping them develop a worldview when you discuss books with your kids and the plot points of the story, and you're teaching them to put everything under the grid of scripture in their lives. And that really only comes as you have great conversations with them.
Well, speaking of conversations, this has been a really good one, Jamie, and I thank you so much for being here. So can you share to the listener where they can find out about you? I know we've mentioned the blog, so please share about that. You've written some books. Where can they be encouraged by you more?
Yeah, the easiest place to find me is jamieerickson.com. That's where you can learn about my books that I have written and my podcast and my blog, and also my bibliophiles community. So if you're a mom who has one of those kids like Leah and I do that just is a voracious reader and you just can't keep enough books in their heads, we are a membership community that puts out monthly book lists for kids that are free of language and graphic violence, sexual content, political agenda, all those things that we want to safeguard and keep watch care for our kids. And we also have a Facebook community that sort of helps crowdsource book suggestions for like-minded parents. So that's kind of where you'll find me these days.
Thank you. I will put all of those links in the show notes. And again, thank you for being here today.
Thank you. It's a delight.
Right about now, you're probably working on your list of books to read. You are feeling inspired. I'm feeling inspired as well. And so I want you to take action on what Jamie has shared. She gave a couple of links. I'm going to put those in the show notes just for you to be able to follow her a bit more and read her books. Go and check out her blog, join her membership to really find out more about books and for that guidance. But I am just so blessed by this episode today, and I know that you are as well. So thank you for listening today, and I'll see you back here soon.
Thank you for listening, friend. I'd love to connect with you more. You can find social media links in the show notes and share this episode with a friend who could use a boost to her homeschool. See you back here real soon.